Well, friends, it's that time once again where book enthusiasts everywhere are humble bragging about all the books that we read and enjoyed. And of course, I'm no exception to this, with this being my 14th annual compilation. And as always, I'm really excited about this because my reading spans genres and mediums, and so this list doesn't represent one single focus. And so, without further ado, here are the books I enjoyed the most in 2024, or at least the ones that stuck with me. So first up is Van Gogh Has a Broken Heart by Russ Ramsey. And if I had to choose one book that was a contender for my favorite of the year from a spiritual standpoint, it's this one. Russ has done a beautiful job following up on his equally outstanding Rembrandt is in the Wind with this exploration of love, joy, pain, sorrow, and life through the work of 11 painters and contemporary and classic artists, so not just painters, but beyond that as well. And so two stories that stood out in particular to me were the heart-wrenching story of Van Gogh cutting his ear off, a story I wasn't entirely familiar with. And so an immediate takeaway from that is if you've got one of those tchotchkes that makes fun of this incident, maybe you should throw that in the trash. But also even more interesting was the story of Norman Rockwell's trajectory and transformation as an artist, one who was a master storyteller with layers of complexity that we are inclined to miss if we only glance at his work. Every story in this book, though, is a reminder of the complexity of human life and the beauty that God can bring from pain. So get your copy of this book as soon as you can. So next up on the list is Retrieving Augustine's Doctrine of Creation by Gavin Ortlund. As you can imagine, this is a really, really heady read, but it's probably my favorite work of theology proper that I read in 2024, which also happened to be released in 2020. But this book is designed to make us think, to challenge us to consider whether or not we're asking the right questions of Genesis 1 to 3 at all, especially with the debates between different perspectives on how the world came to be, both within different Christian circles, but also beyond that. And this book encourages us to learn from the wisdom of one of the church's greatest teachers, Augustine of Hippo, who wrestled with the first chapters of Genesis throughout his life. And ultimately, Ortlund's exploration of Augustine's teaching encourages us to embrace intellectual and theological humility and curiosity about the subject, to wrestle and to keep wrestling with the text as we seek to follow where it leads. The next book on the list is The Good Gift of Weakness by Eric Schumacher. I wrote a review of this back for the Gospel Coalition in July, so I'd encourage checking that out. But what I'd say about this book is that it is another much needed corrective against the anti-Christian narratives that are challenging us in our moment, those that encourage us to pursue strength on the world's terms and in the world's ways. And instead, this book shows readers the essential goodness of biblical strength, and that strength is born out of weakness. The next book on the list is one that flew under the radar for most people, I think, and that's a shame. It's called The Sex Talk You Never Got by Sam Jolman. Jolman is a professional therapist and deals with men's issues and things like this, and he offers an outstanding counter-narrative to what the world and sadly often the church teaches about men and sexuality. One of the things that I love most about this book is that it calls men to a higher standard, that we're not slaves to our appetites, and thinking that way only dehumanizes us. He also doesn't want us to feel ashamed or confused, which is what we see too often today and leads to a lot of the problems that we also see in the world. And so Jolman wants readers to see the goodness of this aspect of life that God created, to recapture a sense of both innocence and wonder as our understanding is reoriented toward God's intentions. Now, the next book is To Be a Woman by Katie J. McCoy. This is another book that, despite some fairly significant attention early on and throughout most of 2023, is one that, if I had to guess it seems like it's flown under the radar of too many people, because this book is a beautiful exploration of one of the most debated issues of our day that shouldn't even be a question: how to define what it means to be a woman, and a celebration of the uniqueness of women's design. This book was super helpful for me in writing a project of my own that you're going to see in 2025, but I would encourage everyone to read this book. The next one on the list is one from a few years ago. Got some good attention, but I just never got around to it, which was The Case Against the Sexual Revolution by Louise Perry. And this exploration of the fruit of the sexual revolution and the late 1960s will be unsurprising in its assessment for many Christians, because it's very much in line with our perspective. The eradication of the context of sexuality, that is marriage, the rise of hookup culture, and the danger many practices pose to women in particular have been unquestionably harmful to women and to society as a whole. And so Perry ultimately argues that the best thing for women and for society is for us to embrace marriage as a good thing, and to also embrace self-control and restraint. What makes this book stand out, though, is that the author is writing as a non-Christian to society as a whole. When Perry was in college, she held many of the views of her peers, but after working in a crisis center, her perspective began to change, which is what led her to write this book that argues for the innate differences between men and women, something that is seen as, frankly, societally heretical today. And yet it's also true. Perry wrote, and I'm paraphrasing, that there's nothing in this pages that would be novel. And she's right. But here's the thing. Challenging the status quo doesn't require novelty. Sometimes it just takes common sense, especially when we're confronting the unchecked excesses of our hypersexualized culture. So those are the more Christian-specific books, as well as the cultural standpoint books. Now we're getting into some extra fun ones with some fiction and a book with some pictures too. So the next one on the list here is I Cheerfully Refuse by Leif Enger. And so it's rare for a book to be completely not what I expected while simultaneously exactly what I expected at the same time. But that's what happens to me every time I read one of Enger's books. He is a master storyteller, and he knows how to write beautiful sentences that hook you from the get-go, which is what we find in this book's opening line. Here at the beginning, it must be said, the end was on everyone's mind. That's a great line. But what's unusual about this book, and perhaps might be somewhat jarring to those who are familiar with his past works, is that this book is set in a near-future dystopia. But that setting is no less conducive for the kind of meditation that his work encourages, and in this case, meditating on loneliness, grief, love, and community. So I would highly encourage checking this out. This is a great book. The next one on the list is I'm Afraid You've Got Dragons by Peter S. Beagle. And the first time I encountered Beagle's work was through the animated film adaptation of his novel, The Last Unicorn. And so if the theme song of that movie by America is now stuck in your head, I'm really sorry. It's a terrible song. It really is. But I never got around to reading one of his books until this one. And this is a different kind of fantasy novel than is typical in our post Wheel of Time and Games of Thrones era. It's one that is self-aware and has this tongue-in-cheek wit that makes its dramatic moments feel earned as its characters wrestle with their roles as princes, princesses, dragon hunters, and more. And so whether you're a fan of genre fiction or not, I'm sure that you're going to love this book. Now, the next one is a book that I've actually loved for decades. It's a classic work that doesn't require much or any justification at all for being on anyone's favorite book list. That's, of course, The Hobbit by Tolkien. But what made this book make the cut this year had less to do with the content of the book and more about my experience with it this year. See, my son and I, we were on a road trip to Canada together at the end of June and into July. And on the trip, we decided that we were going to actually listen to an audiobook edition of this book. And so it was actually his reaction to hearing Tolkien's words read aloud, the wonder that he experienced from it, that reminded me of my own experience reading it around his age, and so it was just a joy to be able to share that with him, and that's why I enjoyed this book so much and why I needed to have it be on the list once again. Now, the last book on my list is Nightwing Volume 5, The Time of the Titans by Tom Taylor and Bruno Redondo. And admittedly, this one's a little bit of a strange one to add to the list, despite it starring one of my all-time favorite DC Comics characters. I mean, the stories within it function almost as an interlude in the larger story of Taylor's run on the series. But what makes this volume stand out is that it exemplifies and how inventive and interesting Taylor's run has been, and really how this medium can be. I mean, one of the best stories in this is the Eisner Award-winning issue 105 of the series, which is told entirely from a first-person perspective. So you are actually, as you're reading, you're looking at everything that's going on through the eyes of the lead character. And this is something that probably shouldn't work, but the team pulled it off so well, and it's so cool. And, you know, despite not being a dog person, and I'm not even a cat person, despite having one, the addition of Haley, the three-legged dog, who is affectionately known as Bitewing, adding this extra character to the cast has been a delight as well. And so that's my list for 2024. These are the books that I enjoyed. But I want to hear from you. What did you enjoy most this year? Leave a comment, hit me up on the socials, and let's talk about that.